So let's start. So first, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today in this discussion on strengthening American innovation, which includes the USA launch of the Global Innovation Index, a publication that's led by WIPO, and we have our colleague here from WIPO, Sacha, which I'm going to introduce in a minute. We are very honored to host this event today with ITIF, and we have Rob here, the president, joining us today. So the goal is really to host this event with ITIF, and we have WIPO here today, and really discuss not just who will finance innovation, which is the core topic of the GII this year, but also who will do that in the US. What is happening, what is the state of innovation in this country, and how we can improve it further. So to join me in this discussion, as I mentioned, I have Robert Atkinson. He's the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I have my dear Professor Soumitra Dutta. He is the co-founder of Portulans Institute and the founder and co-editor of the Global Innovation Index. He's a professor of management at Cornell University, and he's the president of PI. I have Dr. Zhao Kao, best-selling author and chairman of the Institute for Large-Scale Innovation. And I have my dear Sacha Wunsch-Vincent, who is the co-editor of the Global Innovation Index and the head of section for Economics and Statistics Division at WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva. So I'm gonna moderate this panel. I wanna thank you all for being here with me today. I will ask all the attendants to please mute and close your video for now. We will have opportunity for questions and answers later. So Soumitra, may I ask you and Sacha to present the core data focusing the US, and then we can move into a discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you everyone for joining. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining from, but I hope, first of all, that you and your families are all safe in the midst of this ongoing pandemic. The pandemic certainly has had an impact on some of the discussions and innovations, both inside the Global Innovation Index team and more generally. And I'm sure it'll feature in some of the issues that we will raise later in this panel discussion. Now, I have a small set of slides that I wanted to share. And then what we'll do is Sacha and I will divide the slides amongst us, and then Carolina will lead an open discussion with the panel members and eventually with the audience. So just give me a couple of seconds while I get my slide sharing up. So I hope you all are able to see the slides. And I just want to mention, I'll run through very quickly some of the key parameters or key results from the Global Innovation Index 2020. All the information, the report, the data is all available for free on either the WIPO site or the Global Innovation Index home site, which basically is globalinnovationindex.org. The Innovation Index is something that we started at INSEAD many years ago, and over the years has become a joint collaboration and co-published by WIPO, INSEAD, and at Cornell. And
Soumitra, of course, may you try to put on presentation mode?
It is in presentation mode in my side.
It's not on ours. Maybe can you try again?
Okay, let me see.
Sorry for interruption.
What about this?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. So we also have some industry partners, and we're very pleased to have them. So we have the industry confederations from India, CII, from Brazil, CNI, and the French global technology leader, Dassault Systems, helping take part and finance some of this research. So we have all these partners. And then we also have an international advisory board who are very, very important. And I'm very pleased that both Rob Atkinson and John Cow, who are members of this panel, are members of the International Advisory Board. And together, this is an effort that we believe contributes towards our global understanding of innovation. And the Innovation Index report is in its 13th year of publication this year. And what we believe is over the years, it has had a fairly high degree of impact in helping policymakers understand the phenomenon of innovation a little bit more clearly or a little bit more distinctly, understand how their own economies or countries are faring in innovation, what are the strengths and weaknesses, understand and compare how the performance compares to other economies, and also, very important, put in place a set of policies and agendas for furthering innovation in their own economies in the future. So this is the overall context. And as I said at the start, the COVID crisis clearly has had a very important impact in terms of the discussion on innovation. One of the key questions in this context is, will innovation in fact decrease or drop off as a result of the COVID pandemic crisis? Now, historically, if you look at the relationship between the investments in R&D and the rate of GDP growth, the two have been roughly parallel to each other. They're roughly gone together more or less. But if you think about the last crisis that we have had, the 2009 global financial crisis, since then we have seen a divergence in case of the innovation investment rates and the global GDP growth rates. And the innovation investment rates have in fact increased at a higher rate than the global GDP rates. So this has, in a sense, been a phenomena that we have seen a divergence of the two since the last 10 years. And now an interesting question going forward is, will we see a similar divergence in the years ahead after this crisis? Now, I must say that even though a lot of concerns are there around VC fund financing, and the VC financing certainly has seen a decline around the world in the last few months, what is interesting is important to realize is that a lot of sectors, especially the ICT sector, the healthcare sector, has seen an increase in innovation investment. Some other sectors that have suffered, let's say the services, hospitality sectors, those are sectors where traditionally, I think, a lot of suffering has taken place today. But if you think about the future, which companies are the ones that will survive and thrive in the future, they will most likely have to innovate with digital technologies to survive in the future. So it is quite likely that even in multiple sectors, digitalization and the increased adoption of digital trends will drive innovation in the years ahead. So while there are concerns for some aspects of startup financing, and those have to be rectified, corrected by policy or by other sources of private funding, I think on the whole, there is cautious optimism from the analysis that we see that the total investments in innovation will probably not slack off, in fact, may in fact increase in some countries. Now, if you look at the VC financing across countries, you clearly see that on a comparison of the number of venture capital deals as compared to GDP. Sorry, this is the percentage of venture capital investment as a percent of GDP. Some countries stand out. So if you look at the low-income economies, the middle-income economies, the high-income economies, among the low and middle-income economies, India and China stand out. And of course, the US and some segment of high-income economies stand out in the high-income category. So probably these economies are more able to handle the shocks. But globally, I think this will be an issue that we'll have to confront and we'll have to address in the years ahead. Now, what I'll do is I will speak very briefly about some global results, and then my colleague Sacha will come and focus a little bit more on the US specific results. So if you look at the rankings, so the Innovation Index is a relatively large body of work, and there are lots of different elements that actually we study as part of this piece of report. But part of the results we produce are a set of rankings of countries, typically about 130 countries every year. And of course, a lot of attention is paid at the top set of these countries. So if you look at the top 10 this year, the #1 ranked country is Switzerland. Switzerland has been in that spot for a number of years already. #2 is Sweden. #3 is the US. #4 is England, UK, and Netherlands, and so on. Now, what is interesting is that Korea enters into the top 10 for the first time. So Korea is a country that has been moving up consistently and has actually entered in the top 10 deservedly, I think, for its successes in many areas. Now, the US in particular has always been very strong in the rankings. And in many ways, the US is a large country in the top 10. Well, Germany also is a large country, but not as large as the US. So US is probably one of the large, successful country in the top 10 rankings. And the US is got multiple strengths in multiple areas. My colleague Sacha will talk a little bit more about it later on. And clearly, what we observe is why does Switzerland do so well to be there at the top? The basic philosophy of the Innovation Index research is that innovation consists of excellence in number of areas. It's not just in one area like patents and publications. It is in the whole institutional environment area, the political environment, and so on. And Switzerland has done exceedingly well in combining its strengths in multiple areas. So it's like the links in a chain. If all the links are strong, the entire chain is strong. And Switzerland has done that extremely well. In the US, what you find is, of course, the US has tremendous strengths, but not all the links are sometimes equally strong. So that's an issue that I think will come up in our discussion later on. Now, a lot of focus in recent weeks and months has been in the US and the China issue on technology leadership, innovation, and so on. And if you look at some key parameters traditionally that we look at indicators of innovation success, researchers, R&D expenditures, patents by origin, scientific technical articles, what you find is that in all these 4 key areas, the US and China dominate the global space. All of the countries are, by comparison, much, much more smaller in terms of relative success in these areas. You look at the 4 graphs out here. In 3 of them, researchers, patents by origin, and scientific technical articles, China, in fact, today is scoring higher than the US. And this is something that we observe. China has been going up a number of years. And in only the total R&D expenditure, China, in fact, today is lagging the US, where US is slightly ahead. But at the rate at which the increased expenditure is happening in China, probably will catch up and exceed the US sometime soon. So the whole issue in terms of how this global innovation race sort of figures within the US and China is an important theme that has been the discussion in the US quite of late, I think, quite prominently. And I think, one of the important issues that we see in this kind of situation is, what should the country do, not just to sort of, to increase the distance between China and the US, is how does the US not just only try to slow China down, but also in a sense push itself ahead. So I think the whole issue of how do you strengthen innovation inside the country becomes extremely important. Now you can also look at the sort of relative performance of different countries on the GII, which is the vertical axis, and you can look at the GDP per capita in PPP terms on the horizontal axis, and you can actually try and see which countries are performing better than their peers at the same income level. And clearly you see the US, which is in the top right, a sort of big blue bubble, top right dominates, and the US is performing much higher than its peers, and that is the strength of the US economy. We also see China, which is another big sort of blue bubble, overperforming its income peers, and also other countries like India. India is the big orange, yellowish bubble towards the middle of the graph. So you get a sense in this kind of a global picture of roughly which economies are performing better than others on the innovation index compared to the peers. And clearly the US is an overperformer in that respect. So at this point, I hand over to my colleague Sacha for taking over the more precise description of the US. Sacha.
Yes, thank you, Soumitra, for this this great introduction. Yeah, I'll talk a few words about the U.S. performance that will set up the the debate a little bit by our excellent panelists and participants. So this slide actually just recaps the ranking over time, which always has been, around the top 5 in the world. And more recently, in the top 3 was actually Sweden and Switzerland slightly before. So one question and comment we always have is, so how is Sweden and Switzerland better than the US? Something we can discuss. Indeed, these rankings are influenced by a complete set of innovation system indicators on which actually the US doesn't do that well. And also, of course, we scale a lot of variables by GDP or population, and that also disfavors the US slightly. Still, it's a top performer, and what's also extremely interesting as a high income, one of the most developed countries, is that in terms of inputs and outputs, it achieves more and more, almost balance. You see a number of OECD type countries which have extremely high input, education expenditures, R&D expenditures, but they fail to reap outputs and outcomes. Australia is such an example. In the US case, it's arguable that both the private and public sector do enough on the input side, but then they do also enough to actually reap the benefits on the output side with real outputs. And next slide, please. Increasingly, and this is going to be important when we discuss this China-US race also, for a long time, we have focused on quantitative metrics, numerical values to compare the performance of countries, innovation performance or other performance. So in this particular case, just the number of patents, just the number of researchers, just the number of articles. And increasingly, I think the trend in innovation economics goes to realize that just more isn't necessarily better, including for IP, in fact. So we've tried to introduce in the GII some quality-weighted metrics. And so here in this case, it's a quality-weighted metric for universities, in which US scores #1 in the world. Then a quality-based metric for patents, so how internationalized are patent portfolios. And again, US scores about 10, 14. And then the final one is actually the quality of scientific publications. So not only how many, but also relative to China, how well are they then cited? And with that, again, the United States is coming in first in the world, right? So you see that in terms of quality-based metrics with the top institutes, the top clusters, US is always quite front and center. Now, just to compare, so I said #1 for university ranking. China was something like 15, 20 not too long ago, and is now #3 in the quality of universities. In patents filed, US is about 14 in the world, China is 27. So there, although China, as Soumitra showed, is #1 in the world in terms of the number of patents, in terms of this quality-weighted metric, it's slightly, it's below. The wedge between the US and China is still considerable. Now, in terms of the final one, the quality of scientific publications, again, US #1, and China still distant, 13, but closing in relatively rapidly. And this also puts in question all the metrics that we use, because citation data also has a certain number of problems, and then self-citations, has been a number of problems discovered in different research systems around the world of self-citations actually creating inflationary pressures on this index for a number of countries. Next slide, please. So the GII then goes on in 7 pillars to mirror what we call the innovation ecosystem. One central tenet of the GII is that you cannot look just at the number of patents. So it's still very frequent, in particular in the US press, leading newspapers, in fact, that will just gauge the US innovation performance on R&D expenditures or on the number of patents. And then if a country overtakes or doesn't, that is really used as a yardstick. We believe that you have to have a more complete vision of innovation ecosystems, which includes the linkages between public research and the private sector, etc. Now, the good news is that the US is still the model for the world in terms of innovation ecosystems, in particular, and maybe exclusively in those top science and technology clusters that we all know from the United States, right? The question is if that top performance is the case more generally across the United States, but I'll get back to that point. This general issue of concentration versus more regular spread of innovation performance across the United States. Now, when you look at the pillars, what's interesting in this right-hand graph, if you have a high figure like infrastructure 24, that means you're ranked 24th of the world, which is worse than market sophistication number 2. So the worst performance areas of the United States are at the bottom. So infrastructure is 1, and human capital and research. Now, infrastructure, most of you live in the United States. You probably also have seen across the last 2 decades, the relative deterioration of some US infrastructure. Interestingly, it also expands to ICT access and use infrastructure, which, I guess all of you know that cell phone coverage in some parts of the US is still, more difficult than in India or other parts of the world. I think that distance has maybe even grown. We also have the same for investment and sort of productivity figures that we use in the GII. So any sort of figure that would actually be a good proxy for the future situation of US infrastructure is also rather bad, right? Then human capital and research, that is a little bit surprising because indeed, the best universities are in the US, you have some of the best talents in the US. So you have to decompose this a little bit. We have to start first and foremost with the education system. And it's, again, I would argue this issue of private education, which excels and, Ivy League and also some of the top public research universities in the United States, but then compare that also to the general access to good education, which of course might be slightly worse than, for instance, in certain European countries, maybe even in China and certain Asian economies for sure. So that's one. And the second thing, what is quite interesting is that most STEM indicators, so the share of graduates in science and engineering, for instance, in the US is something like 79 of the world, right? Relative to many Asian economies where it's anywhere from 1 to 5 in the world. So it's lagging. Of course, the US has always overcome this sort of problem by importing talent. And this is my last point on human capital. That, of course, has become more difficult over the recent years, first with restrictions, etc., but then also possibly, of course, obviously now with the current crisis, which isn't exactly favoring the inbound mobility of top researchers, etc. What I found quite interesting is that the data that we're using here is first and foremost student mobility. And the data point is from last year, so before COVID. And even there, I was thinking, okay, some of the restrictions probably apply to, highly paid scientists, that actually are hired by companies. But this actually is literally students attending secondary education or master's and bachelor's sort of education in the United States. And even that today is about at 47 in the world, and it used to be around the top 15 in the world. So we've seen before COVID crisis, before any trade wars, etc., also a relative decline in the prominence of the tertiary education system to the world. And of course, this is going to be aggravated now by the crisis in relative and absolute perspectives. One thing that we like to look at for the United States is business sophistication also. This is where US ranks top 5 in the world, so stellar performance. And here really it's, when other countries ask what is the US doing right, then our typical answer in front of a minister in the Philippines or Vietnam or Tanzania, etc., is always to talk about the extremely tight linkages between the public sector, meaning research institutes, publicly funded research, including in defense, etc., plus obviously firms, so these linkages are unparalleled in the world, and that continues to be quite strong. The one thing that we've seen deteriorating is linkages to abroad, and this is shown in R&D financed by foreign players in the United States, but also seen in very typical standard metrics such as FDI. So foreign direct investment into the United States is really, even before COVID, relatively low by historic standards. And if you like the idea that international linkages and the mixing of people and investments actually is promoting sound ecosystems and promoting learning, etc., then that is pretty bad news. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just the strengths and weaknesses. We don't have to go through them one by one. So next slide, and this is my last slide. The GII, in fact, also, in addition to ranking countries, ranks the top science and technology clusters around the world. So these are not innovation clusters, because innovation is also the commercialization of innovations, and so it's hard to measure at a regional level. But this is mostly based on the performance on patents and scientific publications. And again, the United States stands out with 25 out of the top 100 clusters. And the top clusters, of course, there is, you have Tokyo, Yokohama in Japan, and a few Chinese clusters, but most of the US clusters remain relatively unparalleled. So in the discussion, it's going to be interesting to hear from you, from my perspective, who's not in the United States, how you see areas such as Boston, Silicon Valley, impacted by what's going on by the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, in terms of decoupling from the international economy in part, but also the current COVID crisis, right? Whether these ecosystems are more resilient than other ecosystems, or if they similarly are in pain these days. Noting, of course, that a lot of the winners of the COVID crisis in terms of the firms might be firms that are quite particularly strong in the US pharmaceutical, but also ICT, the Amazons and the Googles of the world. So the general question is, I guess, whether the COVID situation has leveraged these clusters and added more dynamism, or if they face also certain slowdowns. Look, this is it from me, because we want to leave enough space for the discussion. And again, I have left the US in 2003. So I still travel there a lot, but it'd be really good to hear from all of you who are on the ground, in particular Rob and John, and also all the participants to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sacha, and thank you so much, Soumitra, for the presentation of the data. I just want to repeat to all the attendants that you are welcome to submit questions. I will read them later. And before I move on to John and Rob, I was curious if you think, Sacha, it's just a matter of time that some of the output measurements will decrease in the US, because we see a lot of the input measurements, like you're mentioning, right? Infra, human capital, the links with abroad, all those seems to be decreasing. So it is a matter of time that the situation gets even a little bit more dire.
Yeah, it's as it's now quite easy to say, it was always hard to predict the future, but unfortunately, it's getting harder and harder by the day. In particular, in the current context is quite unforeseen, right? In terms of, I mean, at least I in my lifetime have not really seen anything like that. So it's very hard for an economist now to speculate. There could be two sides of the story, right? It could be that this actually is a winner takes all sort of situation. It was already. And in fact, this crisis might even accentuate the winners. We already see it in terms of the companies that will win and those that will lose, right? It's definitely not, a firm from some lower middle income country which will benefit from the crisis, most likely. but it might be some of the tech giants already in the United States. You see this with venture capital, in fact. So Soumitra showed this great slide of VC hotspots. And there's essentially just two major ones these days, except for small countries like Israel, Singapore. And this is China and the US. And you've seen that both are bouncing back quite rapidly, but at the expense, in fact, so the inequality between US and other parts of the world is actually increasing probably through the crisis. So that's one side of the story. So it's a winner takes all. On the other side is what you just outlined, that low innovation input expenditures will, and barriers to international mobility will eventually lead to declining output measures. But I think, again, John and Rob are probably better placed than me to answer this.
Thank you, John. Please go ahead. Thank you, Sacha.
So how shall we organize ourselves? Should I say a few words and then Rob? I'd actually defer to Rob to maybe kick us off, but I'm happy to respond to the presentations and discussion thus far.
Sure, I would love if you and Rob do react, and then we have a couple of questions. Well,
I'm sitting right in the middle of a part of San Francisco called South Beach, which is, and I'm on a street where there are 7 unicorns. Also, this is Silicon Valley North in the sense that the major law firms and venture capital funds and service providers have offices within about 2 blocks of where I live, because a lot of people refuse to commute down to Palo Alto and Mountain View, and they want to stay in the city. And these are often offices with no names on the doors because they want to remain stealthy and so forth and so on. So one thing I want to just observe at the outset is that in some respects, it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur. It's very cliched now to talk about this as an era of disruption, but it really is an era of discontinuity when you look at just about every facet of civil society in terms of how we do our education and healthcare and civic responsibilities and just basic business processes. And so the invention process and the entrepreneurial process is, I think, at least from where I sit, operating at a fever pitch. That relates to the topic of venture capital, which I think the 2020 report has done a great job of illuminating. I would observe that, in my view, venture capital really has to be referred to almost as several distinct subsegments. And the segment of greatest interest, I think, to entrepreneurs is the ultra early stage venture capital industry, which is quite reminiscent of the classic Silicon Valley model of find great people, find a disruptive idea, use your intuition and your gut feel and your emotional intelligence to make investments, which in the first crop turned into Apple and Intel and so forth and so on. I've been reaching out recently to friends who are in such funds where they really refer to it as intuitive investing and spreading money around emerging opportunities. And they say that money is pouring into the sector from the limited partners, the large suppliers of capital at quote unquote a breakneck speed. So if you combine that with one of America's last remaining unique competitive advantages, which is our culture and our ability to tolerate failure and our ability to tolerate wild ideas and entertain possibility, which now is, I guess, a term of art in the Biden campaign. You have, coupled with that, the continued availability of early stage capital in an environment where there is arguably a drought in other areas. You still have the ingredients for a tremendous amount of combustion. And if you think about the ingredients, you have talent now, which often is decoupled from jobs because people have gotten laid off. And it's well known that in times of recession, startups and the innovation associated with them tends to flourish. And this, obviously is we're heading into an economic environment of really large and uncertain dimensions, but the same rules apply. Inputs are cheaper. As people leave San Francisco, the cost of housing goes down, cost of office space goes down, the cost of services goes down because demand is less. People are not attached to jobs, so they're writing business plans. And meanwhile, you have these disruptive ultra early stage venture capitalists who are continuing to shovel money out off the back of their admittedly smaller trucks than the mega funds. And of course, you know, you have to be prudent and you have to fund new companies in such a way that they can survive the valley of death and they can make it to the point where they generate revenue. But the interesting kind of counterintuitive fact is that early stage investing is actually investing for the long term. And, you know, there's the famous 7-year hockey stick where you expect that there will be consumption of capital and then there will be a return to neutral and then ultimately profitability. But, you know, the classic model is a 7-year hockey stick, which is very different from corporate venture capital, which insists on, you know, virtually immediate returns. I noted there was a KPMG survey recently that showed that 10% of companies actually insisted on an ROI in their investments immediately, 34% within 6 months, 27% within 12 months, which is a total of 70+%, which is totally unrealistic from the point of view of a entrepreneurial venture and company formation, unless you've invented VR goggles or something like that, where you can cash out, you know, in 11 months, which is an unusual kind of factor. That also leads me to one other observation. I mean, there's so much we can talk about, but I'm just responding with what feels most urgent, and that is the very interesting correlation between innovation investment and GDP, and a point that was made in the index report 2020 about the decline in venture capital. I think, again, it's useful to disaggregate venture capital into different segments because we have experienced what I would call unicorn bloat. There's been a tremendous fashion to invest in, you know, the WeWorks and the Ubers of the world in a late mezzanine round to get a 2x on your capital, which is really low risk, low return, almost merchant banking as opposed to early stage venture capital. And it's clear that in an environment where exits are increasingly limited, the IPO market is uncertain, demand is uncertain, because now these companies have to actually generate revenue and profits, which is not the case with early stage companies, there would be some disillusionment and there would be some sense, you know, I'm sure Masayoshi Son is not, you know, necessarily going to want to invest another $1 billion in another mega fund anytime soon, although, you know, he's a very smart guy and, you know, who knows what he's got up his sleeve. So I think there's much that could be discussed in relation to the innovation system in the United States. And I'd love to maybe engage with that in the Q&A, but I don't want to overstay my welcome here in terms of making initial comments. I will just point out that I think the early stage venture capital and the tempo of entrepreneurial activity are at, if anything, a greater pitch simply because the opportunities are so great. And I say again, it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur if you have some visibility on those assets, and that given the drought in other segments of the financing landscape, this is still, I think, a pretty bright area. So with that, I'll pause and turn the mic over to Bob, my friend and colleague, Bob.
All right, well, thanks everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I've really enjoyed being an advisor to the GII over the years. It's a great report and the folks do great work. Just a couple of quick comments. One is the caveat being, and we've done our own indexes here and there and various things. We do a state new economy index every few years. And indexes are really, really hard to do, in part because we don't really measure innovation. I mean, Europe probably does the best at measuring real innovation in firms, which is really what you want to get at. So everybody is dependent upon proxy measures, how many patents, how much R&D, these sort of things. And so the GII does a great job recognizing that there is this sort of core limitation. And particularly you get that the bigger you go in terms of spread. So OECD data is better, but once you go outside of that, you get less valuable data. Having said that, a couple of things. One is on China. China, it'd be interesting to see. I'd love to see what China ranks if you took out institutions, because they rank quite low on institutions. And yet, for example, on their regulatory quality, they rank 102, which really drags them down. My sense is if you're a favored Chinese company, your regulatory quality is probably pretty high. In other words, they let you do whatever the heck you want. If you're an American company or European company, your regulatory quality is pretty low because they intentionally will use regulation to hamstring you. So, here in sort of a rule of law country, regulatory quality is super important. I think in a country like China, though, it's, is it good or bad? Hard to say. With regard to the US, I think one of the key things there, if you look at where the US does really, really well, as an oversimplification, it's really around IT and even within that, in particular, software. So we rank #1 in the world on software purchases or software usage. And I don't think you can underestimate that or overestimate that. That is so important. There's so many countries that, like in Europe, and they have so many barriers and other problems where the enterprises, Korea is a great example of that. So Korea is a really interesting, innovative country, but they're terrible on enterprise software, just terrible. And the US is the best. And I think we have to recognize that as such a key advantage. And then you look at some of the other things, ICT organizational models, the US ranks #1. Of course we do. Everybody knows we're #1. We come up with the best business models in the world when it comes to using disruptive technology. We're #1 in terms of global R&D companies. So if you look at, I think it's the top 3 global R&D companies. Or if you pick the top 50, we'd still be #1. But the reason we're #1 there is I believe, haven't looked at it in a little while, the top 3 companies in the world, besides Samsung and Huawei, are Alphabet, i.e. Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, all 3 IT companies. So the US really, and then you look at clusters, we do great because everybody outside the US thinks Silicon Valley. So we kind of have 2 economies in the US. One is really incredibly the world's best IT, particularly software and internet companies in the world, by far. China's catching up, but we're still better. We have a new report that we're updating on ranking AI competitiveness in China, Europe, and America, and we're still #1. We're still ahead of China when it comes to AI. But then you go and look at the other part of the US economy, particularly the hardware economy or the non-IT sector economy in innovation. And there we struggle, I would argue, much, much more. And in fact, to the point where I would argue it's close to being a crisis. I think John really made a really good point about some of these investors wanting a return in 6 months. There was a Business Roundtable survey where they surveyed the top 100 CFOs of their members, the largest companies in the US, and they asked them, how many of you would be willing to sacrifice, cut R&D this quarter to meet your quarterly earnings targets? Like 80% of them said, yeah, sure, of course, why wouldn't we? 80%. And that goes to John's point about how the short-termism. And there's an R&D ranking thing, how much R&D, and the US ranks 9th. One of the things we've tried to develop, and we can't do it because nobody has it, if you go and if you could figure out the data, how much of that corporate R&D is early stage versus late stage, I bet the US rank would go down because over the last 20 years, and we've shown this from NSF data, the US has gone up in R&D, in development, and down in basic and applied research. So the overall number looks okay, but the composition, and that gets to this point of sort of long-term capabilities where we're not investing as much as in what Clay Christensen used to talk about as disruptive innovation. We're much more about sustaining innovation. And, that might be good for shareholders tomorrow, but I think in the long term, it has some real problems for the US going forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rob, so much. This was an incredible discussion so far, John and Rob, and thank you again, Sacha and Soumitra. It really calls my attention, the data and this difference between R&D in the beginning of the value chain, or like the development chain, and later on. I remember some years ago when I reached out to a lot of the innovation research centers that were funded with billions in the very beginning of the Obama administration. And I interviewed all of them. And I was asking them how you know you are being successful with these grants, right? Lots of innovation centers popping up in the US at that time because of this new grant program. And they said it's all about papers and patents, right? And it was basic research like biology, physics 101, right? They were not going into more modern knowledge management frameworks to really share and really being interdisciplinary, right? So it was very, very shocking. And actually, because of this relation, I would jump to a question that came from the audience before I go to my questions, because it's related to this exact point, is what should be the new metrics for innovation beyond patents, papers, citations? Should we think about open source metrics, cloud computing metrics, collaboration-based metrics, and how could that support this long-term investment thinking? Who wants to take the question?
Well, let me begin, and perhaps John, you raise your hands. Go ahead.
Well, I think that's a very important question, because it begs the question of how you define innovation and therefore what you measure. You know, we have this Endless Frontiers Act that's been proposed by Senator Chuck Schumer as part of a new progressive agenda, $100 billion. And the major innovation there is they're going to take the National Science Foundation and magically transform it into the National Science and Technology Foundation. So that definition is technology. You know, you could argue that a lot of the narrative around innovation is based on the valuation of basic research. So the more scientific research you have, the more innovation you have. On the other end, you know, you might say, well, innovation really is expressed through entrepreneurial activity that makes use of creative assets that leads to the generation of economic and perhaps even social value, right? So that would imply bringing in a whole host of other less tangible measures as well. And then there's the question of inputs. If you believe that design thinking is a methodology that's very relevant to innovation, well, what's the prevalence of design programs in universities and people who've been certified in design thinking and design centers of excellence? If you believe that human capital is one of the inputs to an innovation economy, shouldn't you be looking at measures of education success and outcomes that are not just tied to four-year college experience or graduate school? If you believe that diversity in society is important, a key enabler of that is access to broadband. And, you know, maybe that's an index as well. There was a recent report that suggested that even in Manhattan, which probably has the fattest internet pipes of any place on the planet in terms of Wall Street, if you go 5 miles north, you've got people living in tenements with no broadband, who have to at the same time go to school and, you know, be a contingent workforce and things of this kind. So I think that the GII has both advanced the state of metrics materially and also has a really important mandate from all of us to really make meaning of this notion of metrics, because it also relates to the question of how do you evaluate a national innovation agenda? How do you know that it's working? You know, if your index is, well, we have more patents, does that really mean the innovation engine is working? Or is that just one facet of a much larger equation?
I could just build on what John just said real quickly. John, I think, rightly alluded to this point about the design, and John's done a lot of great work on that. It's a funny area that the U.S. really doesn't pay much attention to. I mean, you got a lot of countries that are incredibly focused on design. Japan is a good example of that. Italy's a good example of that. I was looking at the index, and the United States ranks 65th in industrial design, and China ranks #1. That ought to be a wake-up call that, you know, we should be building that more. You know, there's a great university or college in the U.S. that we love called the Olin College up outside of Boston. It's only for engineers. It's an undergrad school, but they train engineers from the very beginning, day one, in 3 things: engineering, design and entrepreneurship and starting a business. They have more new businesses out of that school per student than MIT does. So that's an interesting model. We should be doing more with that. One thing to maybe a little nit with what John said. I wouldn't characterize the Endless Frontier as a progressive bill in terms of politics, because it has bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. I'd characterize it as progressive in terms of moving the country forward with regard to progress. So just make that clear.
Soumitra?
Yeah, I think both John and Rob mentioned some very important points. And I just want to add one perspective from the point of view of creating an index. As Rob said earlier, creating an index is a very difficult exercise. It's an imperfect sort of outcome you know that you're headed for. And especially as you're trying to cover the world. If you just focus on metrics for one sector or one country, especially the OECD countries, the high-income economies, you typically have access to much better metrics and you have more better data collection methodologies. If you're trying to be global and trying to cover countries in Africa, Latin America, and large parts of Asia, you hit into immediate hurdles in terms of what can be collected. So yes, a lot of the metrics you mentioned earlier are important, we realize it. Yet collecting it in some effective, comparable manner for many countries in the world is a very difficult exercise, and we have to rely on a number of partners or rely on them to change the methodologies to collect those data. And also what we are finding is that now with this increasing bifurcation of the technology world between mainly China and the US, or China and the West, it's becoming harder to collect data on digital aspects, because the digital systems used in China and the Far East are often different from digital technologies systems that we use in the West. And so even finding comparable data is becoming a challenge across major parts of the world these days.
Thank you, Soumitra. So just also, I want to acknowledge that the question before was done by John Wilbanks. He's the Chief Governance Officer for Sage Bionetworks, and they do a lot of innovation and research using a lot of governance for open data in science, and they are doing a lot of stuff on COVID right now. So I just want to respect and give attribution. Now, just going back to the questions we actually had planned, I thank you all, the panelists, and this, to bear with me since I throw a ball at you by giving you a different question from the previous list. So how should we characterize the current state of the US innovation and how has it been impacted by the dual economic and public health crisis of COVID? We cannot not talk about COVID. And when do you think that impact will be, when we will be able to measure that impact in the GII?
Do you want me to go first for the GII? So
Please.
Yeah, that will take a long time. I mean, public data on R&D, for instance, comes with a 2-year lag, no matter if you're the US or a poorer sort of country. And if then you are asking for impacts such as access to good high quality education throughout I mean, anything overcoming this divide that John described and Rob also in the US, but including the impact on linkages, etc. I think that's going to be it's going to be a long time down the road. I was quite interested in John's comments on the impacts on entrepreneurship, and that'll be quite interesting to hear from, because I think he's at the pulse of what's going on. And it seemed like the cliche that a crisis, is a good time for entrepreneurs. That he thinks that's true. That would be interesting to hear more about, because I mean, from my networks, I heard quite a dearth of finance and impossibility to get first rounds of finance, lack of visibility on the next few months and how this is going to go ahead, both for students, but also for young entrepreneurs. So I think that would be interesting from the US perspective to hear more about. But the GII, most of the GII data will only really be able to capture this 1-2 years down the road. And even then, I doubt that this will really describe the health status of the ecosystem, right? And how these things work together. That is a few more years down the road, probably.
John, please go ahead.
So obviously the pandemic is a huge tax on society globally. And so it is using up a lot of capital in the friction of dealing with the pandemic. The issue, however, and there are certain other imponderables, like we don't know the outcome of the US presidential election. We don't know where the stock market is going to head. And, you know, a lot of entrepreneurship and venture investing is very much done with an eye towards public markets and exits and things of this kind, which are already somewhat limited, even in the pre-pandemic era. It's always difficult to raise risk capital for ventures, you know, especially when the venture is just a pile of paper on your desk or your classic 10-slide PowerPoint deck. But I think what has to be understood is that there's an ecosystem of early stage venture investing that actually is a kind of an innovation manufacturing base, if you will. I mean, I don't mean manufacturing in the sense of manufacturing goods. I mean, in terms of manufacturing ventures, where you now have mega funds. I mean, very smart people managing billion-dollar and multi-billion-dollar pools of money, but still pouring that into early stage investments and creating ecosystems of related ventures. So, you know, a company like Andreessen Horowitz, for instance, probably has, I'm guessing based on previous data, I'm not privy to their internal statistics, but probably has 50 investments in AI and data science. That's one venture fund. XL Partners, similarly, a big venture, a big venture fund. And so I think that innovation that matters will always find funding, and A-list entrepreneurs will always be able to find funding, even in the most challenging of circumstances. And that's why I base my comment on when I say that there's a lot of activity going on, because I don't think startups, the velocity of startups and the velocity of venture investing has gone down, although that would be something very useful to track.
Thank you, John. Any comments from Rob or Soumitra? And I want to make sure I acknowledge Bruno Lavin, who is one of the co-founders of Portulans Institute and also co-editor. He just joined us. Thank you, Bruno, for joining.
I would just make one quick comment, and that is we in the United States, first of all, I think how this all plays out partly depends on how well countries have managed the COVID crisis, but also within that, it's how have the policies to respond to the economic crisis played out. And in the US, we had a program called the PPP program, which essentially a paycheck protection program, which was for small businesses to be able to apply for and get loans that would be forgivable if they didn't lay workers off. And in part because of pressure from those on the left side of the aisle, and I say that as somebody who's nonpartisan, there was real restrictions for equity-backed private equity, or I'm sorry, venture capital firms to be able to get that, get those loans, with the idea, well, these companies have lots and lots of money. Their venture backers should just give them the money. And we argued in a piece that's a huge mistake. What difference does it make whether you're a venture-backed company? You still have capital challenges. If you've lost half of your customers or all of your customers, you're going to lay off your 40 software engineers, just like the dry cleaner or the salon might lay off their workers. So it'd be interesting to see how that all plays out. I think that was a policy mistake that we made, and I don't think other countries made that same mistake.
Thank you, Rob. If I don't have any additional comments, I'm gonna go ahead and move to the next question. I think the next question is a little bit related to what Rob was just saying, right? So what should then be in COVID, but also without COVID? the strategies that the US government and private sector should pursue to revitalize the US competitiveness and innovation, especially because, again, while the global, the consolidated result puts US very high, we see a lot of the measurements, the individual measurements decreasing in some cases, right? So how can we revitalize US competitiveness and innovation, and how can the US retain and strengthen its global leadership in innovation, hopefully not letting COVID impact it so much?
I mean, again, so if I should go first, so the data is quite clear, right, in terms of the pillars. So I think infrastructure is one. We all agree on, in particular, the ICT and broadband infrastructure, but I think it reaches further down to even road and sort of other basic infrastructures. The other point I think we all agreed upon is what some people call it diversity, but I would call it equality in terms of access, you know, to education and also to some of these top-notch, so avoiding essentially concentration of skills and competencies in just particular areas which are just accessible to particular people. So I think that's quite important. Now, so first time I was in the US was in 1992. It was in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was about 17, coming from Georgia, from Germany, and you know, coming from Europe, it was quite amazing to see the large inequalities in the United States. But back then, it was strictly perceived as a strong boon to, you know, success, because some people went faster, some others, the state wasn't providing everything. I think the question on the table now is whether, you know, whether this sort of inequality that we face today is still healthy or not, right? And I think many others said the same thing, but those would be my two.
Thank you. Yeah, before moving forward, I would just want to comment that I agree very much with you. I'm a Brazilian living in the US, so you see all those disparities that really call your attention. How can that be, right? But one disparity that really called my attention, I live in Maryland, just at the border with DC in Chevy Chase. And I was very surprised how in my kids' school, which is a public school in a very good neighborhood, over 20% of the kids did not have any computer at home, right? So the state had to really come up together in a very fast manner and distribute Chromebooks to the kids. And I might be wrong, but it's not clear yet if the kids will keep those computers or not, right? So you are giving some infrastructure, but now that infrastructure might not be there, or of course infrastructure decays with time. So I'm very worried with what's happening with a lot of kids that might be left behind during this, and how that actually will impact later with skills for innovation and how people work together, so forth and so on. So any comments?
Yeah, I would just comment a couple of things. One, I would caution the narrative that somehow the US digital infrastructure is subpar. I don't really think that's the case. We lead, with the exception of the Chinese, who have really artificially ginned up their 5G market. We certainly lead Europe on 5G. There are still places in Europe that are doing 3G. It's, you know, the challenge for the US is that we are much more rural. We've got big spaces, and yeah, there are challenges there. But if you go to most urban areas, you know, even to John's point about not having broadband at these big housing complexes, they have broadband. What they don't have are people who have enough money to pay for the broadband, and you know, that's a different challenge than the infrastructure. And it's a critical challenge, but we have to differentiate that. It's not, I don't think we have an infrastructure challenge. Our broadband providers have been rolling out, we have more fiber than Europe does. I mean, Europe has these, in my view, you know, harmful rules around unbundling, which has meant that they haven't laid more infrastructure pipes in the ground than the US has. On the inequality issue, I'll probably get in trouble for this, but you know, for many, many years, the right had this narrative that, oh my God, inequality is the engine of US growth. And if you raise taxes on the rich, you know, you're going to squash innovation incentives. And that, you know, look, there was no empirical evidence of that because it's wrong. I worry that we're flipping the narrative exactly the opposite, that somehow, you know, if we don't do more on to address inequality, we're going to fall behind. Look, there are lots of really good reasons to deal with inequality. I mean, I think we should raise taxes on the rich. I think we should spend more public goods for lower income people, but we shouldn't delude ourselves, in my view, that it's going to be the magic bullet to drive innovation and competitive success. The magic bullet to do that is not somehow to give more money to low income people. And you can argue for or against that, but it really, I don't think, is the center of what the challenge is. The center of the challenge for the US, in my view, is we had the world's greatest innovation system from 1940 to 1980, by far. This is why that's why we're in the lead, and why we haven't, or close to the lead, and why we haven't dropped even farther. You know, in 1964, the United States government spent more money on R&D than every other country and non-US business combined. So just the government itself was spending all that amount of money. Nowadays, you know, we're spending about half of what we used to spend as a share of GDP. US government R&D is below Sputnik levels, pre-Sputnik levels. You have to go back before Sputnik. And it's going down every year. And there doesn't seem to be, that's why I like the Endless Frontier Act so much. That's why I like the CHIPS Act. So I think the most important thing for the US is to make innovation-based competitiveness the top agenda item in the United States. You look at China, that is China has like 3 goals. And the first one is to become a world leader in innovation and technology. And that's also what the second and third one are. Yeah, that's all they want. That's all they want. Whereas the US, what are our goals? Well, maybe to become a clean environment, maybe to deal with inequality, maybe to have more freedom if you're on the right. And, you know, as long as we keep doing that, rather than say, how do we create a new kind of innovation system? I mean, John's talked a lot about this as well. You can't just rely and rest on your laurels. And we continue to do that in the US. You know, as long as we're number 3 in the GII, and we could drop to number 6, number 7, we'll be, you know, what's that, another 10 years of slow, gradual decline? Well, sure, that's fine, you know, we'll just criticize the methodology. But the reality is we've got real challenges. I mentioned particularly outside of software and internet, we have real challenges. And so, you know, a much more, that's why I think, for example, this bill, bipartisan bill now, the CHIPS Act, $30 to $35 billion for advanced R&D in semiconductors, as well as subsidies to build fabs in the US. We've got to start taking big steps like that. You know, China has its Made in China 2025. They've got their standards 2035 approach. And we're just kind of looking at it and going, yeah, but we're entrepreneurial. You know, that's not going to cut it anymore. You have to be entrepreneurial, but you got to do more. So that's my 2 cents.
That sounds more like at least $5, Rob. Let me build a little bit on what you said, because I sometimes do the thought experiment of looking at the US like it's a company, and that I'm trying to advise a senior person about how to galvanize an innovation agenda, which is the question that you posed in front of us. And for me, the most important issue is, you could call it creating alignment around a shared set of meanings, whether it's a definition of innovation, meaningful metrics, a narrative that creates a sense of urgency and a desire, and most importantly, an alignment, so that innovation isn't some esoteric topic at the top of big organizations, but has a kind of a Main Street component to it as well, which I think in China, you'll see that the notion of being an innovation nation has diffused into a national idea. And it relates to going back to the moon and being #1 in AI and building a lot of aircraft carriers and all kinds of national prestige projects that actually galvanize the public. And right now, we don't have that narrative. You know, we're in a bit of a confused state and divided state right now. The second priority is, I think, what I call stewardship. And I've written a lot about innovation stewardship as opposed to governance, because to me, if you do a a large-scale innovation effort, so in other words, a national agenda, it has to be a kind of a coalition of interests that are able to come together in some kind of a belly button that is responsible for the strategy. And so it's not only the federal government, it's not only FANG companies or venture capital funds, it's not only universities, it's not only state and local government, et cetera, et cetera. It has to be a kind of a holistic, whole of country process, which in fact is the approach in other often smaller and easier to organize kind of societies out there. And then related to strategy, I think, you know, in some respects, strategy is nothing more or less than what you're going to do and what you're not going to do given your resource base and how you prioritize. And there's so many avenues to explore in terms of what a national strategy for innovation should be, could be about. So, you know, is it about mobilizing around climate change? Is it mobilizing around next generation IT and sort of digital society? Is it the sustainable development goals and global, you know, kind of societal scale wicked problems? You know, is it kind of fixing the present, or is it creating the future, or in what combination? And is it able to avoid the Christiansonian innovator's dilemma of only focusing on improvement? Like, let's get 5% more patents next year, as opposed to disruptive innovation, which is let's, you know, use this crisis as an opportunity to rethink how we do voting, how we do education, how we do healthcare, how we do business collaboration and things of this kind. So these are all soft issues, but to my mind, they're the most difficult and also, in a sense, the foundational ones. What is the narrative, or what's the story? What's the stewardship process, and what's the strategy? And then once you have that, you can then begin to address issues of integration, right? So you want 50 innovation hubs across the country. You want universal access to broadband. You know, what are the fiscal policies for creating more capital for investment, R&D credits, you know, local governance structures, and things of this kind. But I think the first steps are the story, the stewardship, and the strategy.
Thank you, John. That was great. Thank you, Rob. I want to bring a question from the audience because it's related, and I want to make the link very explicit here. So the question came actually after one of your comments, John, on the importance of this new generation of entrepreneurship, right? Has an important element to this whole system, to this whole ecosystem, let's say. But that now you also brought all these soft elements, right? And before, in the beginning of this discussion, we did mention the possibility of including more soft metrics, or metrics that are more modern in terms of how people actually do innovation, right? Design thinking, new models of CMMI for software. You have all those new ways of people using cows to create, right, in a certain way. So this is a question actually for Soumitra and Sacha. The moment you include a certain metric, that metric can actually become an incentive to generate this narrative that John was mentioning, right? This narrative that people can really get motivated and come together to pursue. How do we measure the soft issues? Is there a way to do that? Because again, they bring narrative, and narrative bring incentive for change.
So I'll maybe go first, and Sacha can probably add his perspective. So the first thing is, you know, when you add a metric to the innovation index, part of the goal out there is not just to say this is important for innovation, but also part of the goal is to raise the awareness of the key leaders in the public and private sector. This is an important aspect to include in your discussions about innovation. I'll give you one example. We had some members of the Costa Rican government, and Costa Rica is one of the high performers in Latin America, who came and told us that, well, look, you know, inside our own national agenda for innovation, we never included the creative services sector. as an element of innovation. And we never actually thought of that as being important. But now, given that the Innovation Index explicitly includes that as one of the pillars, we are much more cognizant of that role of creative services sector. And we now take pains to make sure that our metrics and our agenda items and our policy include that. So I think there's a clear role of influencing and the thinking, which is important, shaping the thinking. Now, the challenge, of course, you mentioned is a measurement. Measurement is a challenge, as I mentioned earlier, because as soon as you go across, first of all, is the question of what was mentioned, I think, by John and Rob earlier, of measuring some of the phenomena itself is complex, even in a clean environment. How do you measure creativity, for example? That even in a clean environment is a complex debate. Second is when you take those kind of questions to a broader set of 130 countries, you can't often find objective hard data. You have to go through a questionnaire-based kind of analysis. Having questionnaires delivered and administered properly across 130, 135 nations is another logistical nightmare, besides the issue of cleaning up data and whatever comes back in return. So, there's a lot of investment required for that. And I think this is an ongoing process. We work with partners out here. The World Economic Forum has been a very good partner, at least some of the qualitative data, but there's much more that can be done on that front.
Thank you. Sacha?
Look, I don't have much to add because Soumitra nailed it. I mean, it comes with a lot of responsibility, right? When you do this sort of additional metric, because you disrupt a time series comparability, and you actually do lead countries, many countries, not necessarily the US like that, but many other countries are then chasing that metric. So you are then hoping that you don't send them down the wrong alley, right? But so you mentioned the creative sector, Soumitra. What we did also is in the area of environment, environmental innovation, introduce a few things, or also in the area of gender. So there's a variable on the share of females in knowledge-intensive employment. Yes, and again, I mean, I think we probably are right in setting that tone, but does convincing theoretical empirical literature demonstrate that in a clean environmental situation or gender equal sort of environment leads automatically to a more innovation around? I think at the moment it's probably more belief than fully demonstrated, but we're thinking we're doing the right things here. So you have to be able to and willing to experiment. In fact, this is my last point. I made a lot of notes today, and the next thing over the next 6 months, we'll be playing, with Bruno, with Soumitra, and everybody else with some of these metrics. And I might come back to you and say, you mentioned some, big data and so forth. So should we, disrupt the GII model, yes or no? And then we usually go through months and months of research, and then at the end of the day, we don't go because the risks are too high, the data point is weak. But we do try to move the needle in the discussion as well with this new indicators. Thanks.
Thank you, Sacha. John, Rob, do you have any comments? Otherwise, I'm going to move to our next question. And I just want to mention to all the attendants, we have 8 to 10 minutes to the end of the panel. So if you have more questions, please let me know here in the chat. So Soumitra, since you are a professor and you go through lots of students and MBA students every year, I found this survey from 2019, where nearly half of the Harvard Business School's alumni believe that the US competitiveness will decline in the coming years. Do you agree? Yes or no? Why not? Or it's just hard to foresee the future right now? And it's interesting to say because a lot of those folks are foreigners.
So, I've had some benefit of global exposure in my career. So I come from India. I lived for 20 years in Europe. I lived for many years, got an education in the US. And what I can tell you is the US is unique. yes, you can criticize the country for a number of defects, no question about that, and no country is perfect. You know, you can criticize every single country that I've lived in or traveled to. But the US has some strengths which still, in my honest view, makes it and keeps the innovation leader in multiple ways. And deep strengths are things that, you know, have been talked about already, so I will not repeat them. But I think I tend to agree with Sacha's, you know, he said there are two worlds that might appear. One world is, you know, there is a winner takes all kind of syndrome. Other world is, you know, the world comes crashing down. I think the US is going to come out stronger out of this. The same thing happened in the 2009 global crisis. You know, everyone said, you know, the whole mortgage crisis is a disaster, financial economy, and, you know, things are going to crash in the US. And in reality, what happened is the demand for the dollar went up. The dollar actually became stronger. It's like the same story, you know, when in a playground, you know, there's a fire, the children run to the teacher. Who's the most strongest in the playground, basically, you know, essentially gets that role of leadership. And the US still is the role, has the most dominant technology, has the most dominant currencies. And these are tremendous strengths, has some of the biggest companies. Yes, Chinese are catching up. There are some challenges out there, no question about it. But I do believe that the US strengths are going to get reinforced. Now, that does not mean that there's a time to sit on the laurels and say, okay, great, you know, Amazon is becoming stronger, Google is becoming stronger, let's forget about it. The reality also is the problem in the US is inclusiveness. I think we have growing inequality, as mentioned earlier. We have a lot of class divides that are actually quite unfortunate, that don't let a lot of people benefit from the benefits of, you know, all the good things in the US. So I think there has to be some kind of collective action. And as mentioned earlier, public, private, government, private sector together to try and reduce some of that gap and make society more inclusive. So my strong belief is the US is going to become stronger. There's no tangible threat to US decline. But I think, of course, you can always hurt yourself. So in many ways, the US is hurting itself in some respects, but I do believe that the fundamental strengths are quite strong.
Thank you so much, Soumitra. That was a great wrap up. I just want to make sure to give all our panelists the opportunity for final thoughts, and then I think we can wrap up. John?
Well, as someone who taught at Harvard Business School for 14 years, I have to say you should always take what Harvard MBA say with a grain of salt, but that's not really how I want to conclude my comments. I had an experience last year where I was in Washington talking to a senior government official, and we were talking about innovation, and he said the following. He said, we tried innovation and it didn't work, so now we're moving on to other things. And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity. The thing that excites me so much about our conversation today, thank you to all my colleagues here, and also to what GII is doing, is that we are at this cusp of really, I think, transforming innovation from being an art to a science. And I don't mean that all science is all good either. It's a mixture of the two. But I think this notion of, you know, the kind of loosey-goosey ideas about innovation that are still circulating around, the very partial definitions and so forth and so on, are going to inevitably give way, given the importance of innovation, to a more nuanced view of innovation as a discipline and as something that can pass through the lens of a new science.
Thank you, John. So much, Rob?
Sure. So I think, you know, one of the challenges, one of the issues here is, you know, one of the reasons why the U.S. is still doing as well as it is because so many other places don't have their act together when it comes to innovation policy. And I put Europe right at the top of that. I mean, we always had this framework. There's three things you got to get right to be a strong innovation leader. You have to have a good innovation policy system. We don't really. I think the Europeans have a better one. But you have to have a good regulatory climate and a good sort of business environment with good entrepreneurs and the like. That's where the U.S. really does well. So I'm just waiting for a country to sort of figure that out. and do that, like India. I'm waiting for India to do that. I'm waiting for South Korea to do that. South Korea has, in many ways, really, really enormous opportunities, but they don't really fundamentally embrace innovation. They don't want the disruption. But at the end of the day, I kind of don't care whether the US goes up or down relative to other countries. I only care about one other country, and that's China. That's the only thing I really care about. And on that measure, we're going to lose. Or I shouldn't say lose. We're going to fall, and they're going to gain. And that's really the most important thing for the US future, and frankly, for a lot of things in the world. So that's where I'm worried about. I think that China is going in the right direction. They're going very fast, and we're not responding in kind.
Thank you, Rob. Sacha and then Soumitra, maybe you can also share your final thoughts.
Hey, Bruno, do you want to take my my 2 minutes, because we haven't heard you, so I think you should take my slot to conclude.
Very kind of you, Sacha. Hello, everybody. Sorry for joining late. I found this was a very exciting high-level discussion. I think the points addressed by John and Rob about what's happening and not happening in the US is particularly enlightening. About John's point about taking innovation from an art to a science, I would say that we need to stay modest. I mean, us trying to measure innovation performance, and recognize that innovation is much closer to alchemy than it is to chemistry right now. There is something magic which remains difficult to measure. It has to do with stewardship, as John mentioned. It has to do with mindsets. It has to do with enthusiasm. And I think one of the reasons why China has put innovation at the top of their agenda is both historical and future looking. Historical, because China still works on this hypothesis that the domination of the West was a parenthesis of 200 years, which is closing soon. And also because the younger generation is excited about the future. I think that's a major difference between China and Europe, for instance, the degree of enthusiasm of younger generation. Regarding the US, I think the important points have been mentioned. It is still the leader in so many areas that matter for innovation. It's difficult to anticipate that the decline would be so brutal as to challenge the hierarchy. Yet I would tend to agree with Rob that the reason why one of the reasons why the US is at the top is that others are not doing it as well as they could. So that may also change, and there are so many uncertainties. Not all of them will be dispelled in the next few days or weeks. That is difficult to make clear prediction, but I still stick to my judgment that we are closer to the realm of alchemy than to that of chemistry. Thank you, Sacha, for your courtesy.
So maybe from my side, I'll just close by saying, the GII is a great collaborative effort. I thank John and I thank Rob for being part of it. I thank my co-editors, Bruno and Sacha. And we will keep, trying to do our very best to understand some of these issues of innovation through the GII reports. And I welcome all of you to help contribute and participate in that effort. So thank you very much.
So thank you everybody for being here today, and I really want to thank and appreciate the time of our panelists today. My name is Carolina Rossini. I'm the CEO at Portulans Institute, and I have shared in our chat where you can follow us both in LinkedIn, Twitter. We have a YouTube channel where this is going to be later posted. And if you have any questions, you can email us at info@portulansinstitute.org, and we will be available. The whole data of GII is a set of data that can be shareable. So if you need that, just reach out. And thank you so much to all of you. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.